The phone kept ringing from messages that came through on it. Some guy stood wide-eyed and staring off into the distance. He stood at the river's edge, holding onto the railing, while the lights of the city burned on the horizon. A small shiver ran through the guy from the cold. His eyes were full of tears. The bad thoughts were getting worse and worse. Suddenly, someone called out to him from the back. It was some old man. He looked at the boy with wide-open eyes, wondering what was bothering him so much. The man came so close that he was right next to the boy's face. He couldn't resist. His feet slipped and he fell just into the river. The man stood on top and just watched as the guy plunged into the water. The guy was floundering in the river. He couldn't swim. The moon was shining in the sky. After a while, the boy and the elderly man were sitting by the fire warming themselves. The guy was crying, talking about his debts and problems. The man listened to him, reasoning that debts are not the best, especially if there is no money to pay back. Suddenly, an idea hit him. He wanted to help. The guy was already tired and sleepy, barely seeing the man. The man gave him something with the words that it should help. There was a lamp shining on the ceiling. The guy barely opened his eyes. His head hurt terribly. He sat on the couch at home, his hands groping his head, trying to figure out what had even happened during the night and how he had ended up at home. Suddenly, someone's voice sounded. The boy looked questioningly at his hand. There was some kind of ring on it. He was frightened without realizing what it was. A dragon-shaped ring was on his hand and it spoke. The guy was stunned. He grabbed his hand, not realizing what it was or where it came from. The ring spoke. It introduced itself as the Ring of Electricum. The guy got scared. He repeated the name of the ring. The ring asked to introduce themselves in return and give a name. The guy introduced himself. His name was Jian Min. The ring asked if he remembered what happened last night. Jian Ming hesitated for a moment. Without waiting for a response, the ring announced that they would be together for the next couple months. Jian Min continued to sit on the sofa and examine the ring. Suddenly, the dragon on his finger commanded to tell him something. Min didn't understand what it was about. A silent pause hung in the air. The dragon went into a screaming fit. He shouted to tell how much the guy owed to the people he borrowed from. Min was a little taken aback by this. He took out his phone and showed the screen. With annoyance and sadness, he said that his debt was almost 500,000. The screen showed the amount of the loan, and that the 7-day period was about to expire. The ring dragon, with a sly look, advised me to check the price of gold now. The boy stared at the aide's ring. He didn't understand what it was for. The dragon couldn't stand it again, and shouted that there were too many questions. The rate and price of gold will be displayed on the screen. The dragon thoughtfully calculated that only 2 kilograms of gold were needed to pay off the debt. The dragon thoughtfully calculated that only 2 kilograms of gold were needed to pay off the debt. Clinging to the guy's finger with its paws, the dragon assured him that it was not that much, and it only needed 0.8 liters of the guy's blood to create that much gold. Jian Ming was worried sick to his stomach. He looked at the assistant's ring with sad eyes, causing the dragon to be perplexed. The boy laid his head down tiredly on his hand. He was trying to find out from the dragon if he really needed blood to make gold. He tried to ask the dragon if he really needed blood to make gold. Suddenly, a strange noise caught their attention outside the door. There was someone knocking on the door. Min was in a panic. He looked at the door and realized that it was the money collectors. The dragon wondered why they were so afraid of ordinary collectors. There were 2 men standing outside the door. They knocked on the door and demanded that it be opened immediately. The poor frightened boy didn't know where to put himself. He was running from side to side, not knowing what to do. The collectors were already picking the lock. They were about to open it. Jian Ming, neither alive nor dead, pale in color, swallowed heavily without breathing. The door yielded easily and the 2 boys stepped inside. Min was trembling all over. One of the intruders glared at him angrily, asking if he cared about his life. Min barely answered that it was. The collector kicked him to the floor. He questioned whether Min was planning to escape. He argued that he would pay back his debts and just needed a little more time. The bandit was beating him. The other one calmly hid the lockpick set he had used to break the door, and no less calmly stopped his accomplice. If he beat Minya too badly, he'd have to pay for a doctor. He stopped. They decided to leave. Min sat battered with a swollen face, but didn't give the appearance that anything displeased him. The collectors headed for the exit. At the end, one shouted that the money had to be on the 9th day at the latest, or Jian Mingyu would be in trouble. The door slammed shut with a single tug. The humiliated boy lay on the floor and stared at the door. The dragon ironically noted that it only got worse. Poor beaten Min almost cried. He didn't care for the ironic remarks. He picked up his phone that had fallen to the floor. The screen was shattered. The ring helper encouraged him to pay back his debts as soon as possible. The boy got up and left the apartment. The dragon, not understanding what was going on, asked where he was going. Closing the door behind him, Min replied that he wanted to buy bandages to dress his wounds. Some noise made him turn around. The neighbor's grandmother opened her door, apparently having heard the noise. She gave the guy a sneering look. He tried to smile as friendly as the wounds on his face would allow. He said good morning, to which Granny just slammed her door with all her might. The already drooping boy became even more upset as he looked toward the neighbor's door for a second. He snickered and lowered his head. Jianming walked outside. His mood was not very happy. The dragon ring wondered why the neighbor was being so rude. The boy gave a strained smile. He assumed no one would want to mess with him. The dragon scolded the boy for being soft. He taught him that he should have beaten up those bandit collectors so they wouldn't show up again, and that such kindness and gentleness wouldn't do any good. Min took a deep breath. He replied that he would sooner be beaten than get tougher. The dragon replied that to act according to his plan was to be beaten, and he looked terrible. Minya was angry at such truth in his eyes. He walked up to the drugstore. The guy went in and picked out what he needed and walked out of the drugstore with the bag. Ring asked where he was going now. Min replied that he needed to go get something to eat. The dragon agreed. Min came to the cafe and took a free table. The waiter brought the noodles he had ordered. The poor beaten Min looked at the waiter and thanked him. He picked up the chopsticks, separating them in one motion, and started eating his noodles. He paused for a second, addressing the ring. Looking at his plate, he asked the dragon how it was possible to turn the blood into gold that the dragon had mentioned earlier. The ring aide reluctantly brushed off that he would just take the blood and turn it gold, that's all. Minya wasn't satisfied with that answer. He asked for more details. The ring replied that first he had to take his blood and pour it on the stone. After pausing for 10 seconds, the dragon leisurely continued that then the part of the stone on which the blood would solidify would turn into gold. Min thought it was some kind of mockery and informed the dragon. But there was nothing to do but hope, and there was nothing to do. The guy went to the waterfront to pick out a suitable rock. The ring dragon confidently continued that everything he had said was true, and all one had to do was try to make it happen. Min was indignant. He insisted that it would hurt him and he would have to bleed himself. With a smirk, the little helper remarked that it would hurt a lot more on the 9th if he didn't find the money and pay back the debt. Jianming picked up the knife. He sighed doomedly. There was no choice, and there was no other way out either. He brought the knife to his palm and began to cut it, squinting in pain. Then as the blood flowed, he held his hand over the rock so that the drops of blood would fall directly on him. And suddenly the unbelievable happened. The blood began to slowly solidify, and as it solidified on the stone, it turned into real gold. The blood solidified completely, and the stone became half gold. Min was in complete shock. The dragon replied that it did work. The little helper offered to sell the stone to a jewelry store and get the money for it. A couple more stones like that and the debt would be paid off. The guy, as mesmerized, looked at the stone covered with gold without taking his eyes off, gave his consent to the idea of the ring. He came to the jewelry salon. There was an exquisite sign above the door that read, "Having to wait for the jeweler for some time, Min sat in the hall with the stone on the table. Some tension and fear was picking him up. Finally, the jeweler appeared with a weighty bag in his hands. He placed the bag on the table against the stone. Opening the zipper, it was obvious it was stuffed with money. Jianming took the female. They shook hands as a sign of a deal gone well. He left the jewelry salon, hugging the bag with both hands. The girl assistant said goodbye politely. Stepping outside, Min was very nervous. He was certainly glad that everything had gone quickly, and that no one had asked questions about where all that gold had come from. But the tension was still there. The ring dragon tried to calm the guy down. He said that for the first time, no one would ever ask where the gold came from. It was a lot of money now. It was necessary to do it a couple more times, and then the debts would be forgotten. Also, the ring assistant reminded about replenishing strength. He said that you need to eat foods that will help make up for lost blood and strength. You need to eat more spinach and dates, he recommended. This went on for some time. Min used his blood to turn stones into gold again and again. It was June 8th, and the guy was back in the jewelry salon giving another stone. His debt minus 206,000. 19th of June, a new trip to the jewelry salon, a new stone is on the counter, and the debt is already minus 408,000. June 25th, another salon accepts the solid gold stone that Min brought to surrender, and the debt is already minus 206,000. And finally, the day has come. Min stares at the phone screen. Such a long-awaited entry. 700,000 of the debt is listed as paid off. The guy is overjoyed. He clutches the phone in his hand and can't believe it. It's finally over, and he's paid off that damn debt. Suddenly, someone knocks on the door. It's not even a knock, it's an intrusion. Min goes to the door to see who's there. He presses himself against the peephole. What was his surprise when he saw the now familiar face of the thuggish collector who had come last time and beaten him up. The guy calmly opens the door and lets the bandit out. The guy walks in with a cheeky look. He snidely remarks that the debt has been paid. Min tensed and gave a strained smile. He agreed with that, uttering a quiet yes. The cheeky bandit makes himself at home. He notices a plate of dates on the table and comes over to inspect it. He seems to know what the product is for, sarcastically suggesting that someone has donated a lot of blood. The collector carelessly tosses a date into the plate. He says reassuringly that he won't bother the guy again. And then suddenly, he decides to demand a new payment. Here, Jianming didn't understand anything anymore. He fell into a total stupor. He had put so much effort, energy, and blood into this debt, and the impudent man was demanding more money. Min's eyes widened. He tried to say that the entire debt had already been paid. The insolent bandit calmly replied that he was late with his payment. Min just couldn't believe those words. He tried to say something in his defense. And then, the collector just punched him. Min scrambled into a corner, trying to cover his ready hands from more blows. The bandit loomed over him. He was saying that he should be thanked with an extra wad of money for the reprieves he had given over and over again. An unhappy, helpless Jianming sat covering himself with his hands. The ring dragon assumed that he would not be left alone now, as long as there was any chance of getting money out of him. Before he left, the collector said he wanted $10,000. He didn't care where Min got it. He could sell his guinea if there was no other way. The door closed with a mighty, loud slam. The boy sat on the floor with his hands covering his head. The clock on the wall said that evening was approaching. Jianmin kept sitting with his back against the wall. He was thinking about his life. Suddenly, he asked Electrum if the dragon thought he was pathetic. Condescendingly, to soften the answer, all the dragon helper said was that there is a little bit of that in him as well. The bandits were sitting in a cafe. They were quietly eating their noodles and discussing Jianmin's fate. The one who was beating the guy up was sure to shake a lot more money out of him. That thought made him smile. His accomplice did not share such views. He seemed to be the smarter of the pair. He was afraid that Jianmin would snitch on them. The not exactly smart, but strong friend, convinced that Min was too soft-hearted for this. He jokingly suggested that maybe Min was already looking for a way to sell his guinea. And Min was looking. He was sitting in his room at his laptop, searching hard for something. Here on the screen appeared a window with the goods of a metal meat tenderizer. Usually there is one of these in every kitchen. Ring Electrum smirked. He was glad that Min had realized that brutality and physical force must be met with brutality. The dragon was eager to help him eliminate the culprit, but it would be difficult to hide the body, to which Min only asked to be quiet. It seemed he already had a cunning plan. He didn't take his eyes off the monitor as he continued to look for something. It's been a month. It was already the beginning of mid-autumn, outside. Once again, Min opens the door to that hated collector. He enters the room with only one question. Where's the money? Min dryly replies that he has to go to the bedroom to get them. The bandit is pleased. He smiles and says he likes the way things are going. Walking a bit deeper into the apartment, Min squats down to retrieve something from the side of the couch. The collector stands nearby and waits. The next moment, Min pulls out a small bucket filled with blood. With all his might, he decides to pour it on the bandit. He hears some strange movement and barely turns around in time to hear the noise. Min drenches the bandit with his blood from head to toe. Angry and covered in blood, the collector screams, "What the hell is going on here?" The next moment, Jianming points his finger at it and orders the ring to turn it into gold. The bandit would just solidify into a golden statue before his eyes. A second more, and he finally turned into a golden statue, frozen in his evil grimace. Ring Electrum reminds you that Min must return this amount of blood within 2 months. With a deep, doomed sigh, Min only utters a quiet well. Night had fallen. The moon had already entered the sky. The collector's friend remained waiting in the cafe. He had already started to worry that his friend was away for too long and kept trying to call him again and again. But there was no answer. It seemed very suspicious to him. Min was sitting on the floor. He had covered it with several layers of polyethylene and was carefully smashing something with a hammer. It seemed to be the body of a bandit turned into a golden statue. He was taking it apart and separating the pure gold. It took 5 hours of painstaking work. Everything was bagged and ready. The boy looked at the bags and wondered what to do with it all. Ring Electrum, of course, knew the answer. The dragon said that the pure gold should be sold and the leftovers buried. Min agreed with that decision. After a while, the guy was driving his car to the countryside. He was looking for a good place to bury the remains. And lo and behold, a place had been found. Quite far from the city, Min was digging a deep hole. He threw 2 bags in there, inspecting the place to see if it was deep enough. The dragon approved, saying it was deep enough. Meanwhile, the collector's accomplice was already worried that his friend had been gone for quite some time. He went to Minya's door and rang the bell again and again. He stood at the door without releasing the bell button. When no one ever opened, he decided that no one was home after all. Taking a set of lockpicks out of his bag, he was going to open the door quietly. The door yielded easily and opened. The second bandit walked into the room and looked around. He wanted to find any trace of his friend. A deep plate on the table caught his attention. It was filled with gold. As he got closer, he noticed that some of the pieces of gold were stained with blood. He picked one up to examine it closer. Suddenly, a noise from the open door of the apartment caught his attention. He looked toward the door. There was a voice coming from there, and someone was clearly approaching. Min had already returned home. He walked down the corridor approaching his apartment and pondered absent-mindedly. He was worried that he had lost a lot of blood. Suddenly, the electrum ring said sharply that there was someone in the apartment. Min was frightened. He began to think who it could be. The bandit walked out to meet Minyu. He stood there and stared at him point blank. Jianming was in a panic. He was staring with his eyes wide open, and only the thoughts in his head about what this bandit was doing here kept him busy. The bandit approached. Min was panicking more and more. What to do, what to say, maybe run, and where to go. The dragon reassured him. They made up an alibi and erased all traces. No questions should have arisen, and now he and the bandit are on the same level. Looking at him stiffly, the collector's sidekick asked if his friend Yin had come here. His phone hadn't been answered for quite some time. The bandit looked questioningly at Minya. He didn't know anything, but he definitely suspected something. Minya broke out in a cold sweat. He realized that he was suspected. The ring deputy immediately counted the bandit's footsteps. He said that the cameras in the area weren't working, which meant he couldn't have learned anything. He advised Minyu to just tell the story they made up earlier, calm down, and just escort him out. The boy tried to calm down. He understood. Displaying the utmost calmness and nonchalance, he replied that his brother Bandit had been here a couple days ago. Such a tone stumped the bandit. He asked what happened next. Min continued, keeping unperturbed. He told that he had been charged by his brother to pay the interest since the debt was closed late. The bandit asked what happened next. Min said he had some jewelry, but he hadn't had time to turn it in to get the money yet. The bandit got angry. He asked about his brother's whereabouts, and Min started a thread about the appearance of money. Jianmin said he has not received any messages about the collector for several days. The bandit wrinkled his face in frustration. He was not satisfied with this explanation. For another second, he stared at Minya, and then leisurely leaned over to his ear to say something. He whispered that if any details of Jianmin's involvement in his bandit brother's disappearance came to light, then Min wasn't a survivor. Irritated, Bandit simply walked further towards the exit. Dragon slyly remarked that his guess was correct, and Bandit didn't know anything for sure. Min stared with frightened eyes at the bandit's trail. He agreed with Electrum's opinion. After leaving Minya's house, Bandit headed for the medical lab. He wanted to find out whose blood was on the pieces of gold from Minya's apartment. The collector's brother entered the lab. He looked around and started looking for employees. There was an elderly man sitting behind the counter. The bandit walked to the counter and caught the man's attention by tapping on the counter. He was asked to wait. The knocking didn't stop, and the man turned around irritably at the sound. The bandit found some kind of package in the bag. He pulled it out. It was a bag of nuggets from Minya's apartment. They had blood on them. He asked if we could find out when the blood got on those stones. An elderly male lab worker pulled out one of the stones. He lifted his glasses and examined the stone. He then looked at the guy and said he needed 3 days of time to find out. Bandit agreed with this. Jianmin was at home. He was looking at the plate of gold and asked Electrum Ring what to do with the leftover gold. He suggested that he could turn it into the jewelry shop again. This time, the dragon refused. Now he said that this batch should be sold on the black market so that he would not be suspected. Min begrudgingly agreed. He walked over to the table and began to go through the pieces of gold to put in his bag. Suddenly, the dragon's eyes widened and said that someone had touched the gold. Min stopped and began to think about who it could be. Electrum said the number of nuggets has gotten smaller. Min didn't understand what the ring meant at first. And suddenly the guy who was the collector's accomplice came to mind. Ring assumed that while Min was in the woods disposing of the remains of the corpse, he broke into the apartment, took the nugget with the remnants of the blood collector on it. Dragon said that all this time that guy suspected Minya. Min tensed up. He was already wondering what to do now. Dragon says there's no election. We'll have to get rid of the collector's sidekick too. 2 days later, the collector's accomplice came to the lab. He pulled back the curtain and walked into the office where an elderly lab technician sat. The one turned around and recognized his past client for leaving a nugget of blood. An elderly lab technician went somewhere. He said the results were ready. The boy tensed, waiting for the result. The lab technician said the blood was frozen 5 days ago and belongs to a young male. The guy got worried. 5 days ago, Brother Yin's collector had just disappeared. His gaze grew harder. The lab technician continued. He said he had never seen such pure gold before. The guy heard everything he needed to hear. He turned around and started walking towards the exit. The lab assistant started reminding him about the forgotten gold. But the guy said it was payment for his labors. After going outside, the guy called Minyu and set up a meeting outside the cafe. Min sat at home listening to the voice from the phone. The dragon panicked. He realized that that guy had already guessed Minyu's involvement. A while later, Min and the assistant collector were sitting at a table in a cafe. The guy calmly started talking. He explained that he took one nugget and gave it for examination. Min feigned surprise. He started to say, so that's where one of the stones disappeared to. The guy continued. Dee told about the results and that the blood belonged to a young guy. Min continued to play his part. He calmly asked, and so what? That guy was saying again that Brother Yin had also disappeared 5 days ago. Min insisted again. He claimed that the blood on the stone was his, and that where Brother Yin was did not matter to him. He showed his shredded hand to convince that the blood was his. Placing his hand palm up, Min showed how deep the cut was. The collector's counterpart thought about it. Min asked for his gold to be returned to him. The guy grinned and lowered his head. Then he looked angrily at Minya and advised him to go to the police and turn himself in if he was the one who killed Yin. Min pounded his fist on the table and demanded an answer to what this guy was implying. The man calmly pushed back his chair and stood up. His face expressed anger and bewilderment at the same time. Min panicked, seeing him like this. The guy squinted his eyes and said that the next time they met, he hoped Min would look him in the eye honestly. He got up and walked away. Min panicked and screamed, demanding an explanation of what it meant. But the guy only disappeared into the crowd. Min stared after him thoughtfully. Dragon summarized that that guy wasn't just going to let it go, and that he had a grudge against Minya. Min said it doesn't matter anymore. He decided that meeting the ring must be his chance to change. Chen took a drink and shared his observation. A world where the strongest must suppress the weakest. Min said that everything will change from now on. Electrum asked if Min had made a decision. He coldly replied that yes, he was. He is willing to put aside his humanity. The collector's guy walked into the nightclub. He walked past the dancing crowd straight to the big doors. The guard standing there blocked the way with his hand. He was told that no outsiders were allowed in there. The guy calmed them down by telling them he was his own. He handed over his business card. It had his name, Wang Huasheng, and said he was in the loan business. The door was opened for him and he was invited in. Van walked through the door and down the hall. Up front, a full man was sitting on a couch surrounded by pretty women. The man asked where he had seen this guy. Wang replied that it was Brother Yin who brought him here. The man remembered. He was surprised that he hadn't seen Inya in a long time. Wang replied that Brother Yin had been killed. A man lighting a cigarette asked if the man had reported the murder to the police. Van replied that he didn't report it, but he knows who did it and wants revenge. The man answered in the negative. He wasn't ready to get into this. And besides, Yin wasn't even working for him. He said he has a huge number of employees and doesn't plan to babysit everyone. Then Wang decided to use his trump card. He told about the top quality gold. The man pondered this information for a moment. Van continued that he needed revenge and the man needed gold and money, and they could find a compromise. The man smiled, already anticipating the gold in his hands. Min was at home. He was waiting for a delivery and the doorbell had already rung. The box was delivered and Min had already opened it. There lay the mask of an Egyptian pharaoh. Dragon said he would give Minyu more time to recover blood and it would be a year. Min replied that he understood. Meanwhile, a van pulled up to the barrier. The guy at the window offered cigarettes to the guard. The guard smiled and helped himself to a cigarette. In the van sat the same Wang who lost his brother and 2 unknown men, all dressed in janitor uniforms. They came to eliminate Minya. Min sat on the floor in front of the basin of his blood and read some incantations. Then, he dipped the mask into the blood and some sort of transformation began. The dragon began to explain that the face of Thutmose could increase a person's potential. You have to put it on, and you will become a different person. Min listened intently. Electrum continued to explain. There are side effects. You may feel like Thutmose himself and your personality may change for the worse. Min asked what else. Dragon said that the rest of it was trivia, and would already be known about in use. Min lifted the blood mask. He looked at it. After a little thought, he decided to put it on. Meanwhile, the mercenaries and Van were already in the house. They took the elevator up. There was an awkward silence. Then Van decided to warn that the one they were following could be very dangerous. The mercenary chuckled. Van didn't understand what was so funny about what he said. The mercenary put his hand on Van's shoulder and reassured him that everyone here was a professional. The elevator reached the right floor. Everyone came out and got ready to work. Min, meanwhile, had transformed. He put on a mask and changed into a costume. Suddenly, someone quietly opened the lock. Min turned around in the direction of the sound. The mercenaries entered the apartment pretending to be cleaners. An empty apartment appeared before them. The mercenary girl turned her attention to the empty deep plate of blood. Min deftly jumped onto the balcony's visor and watched from above. The head of the mercenaries ordered a search. There might be gold in here. If it is confirmed, you need to go back and inform the boss. Min kept watching and listening. Ring Electrum assumed that Wang had found some helpers. The dragon remarked that it would now have to kill all three of them. Min, still wearing his mask, watched the scene. Time kept passing. The mercenaries had been sitting in Minya's apartment for 2 hours waiting for him, and decided to leave already. Min watching them from his hiding place. He saw that the mercenaries had left the apartment. The mercenaries got into the car. Jianmin climbed back into the apartment. Inside, everything was upside down and things were lying everywhere. The dragon noticed that the mercenaries didn't even bother to clean up after themselves. Min thought about it and decided that it was because he wasn't taken as a serious opponent. But that didn't bother Jian Mingya anymore. The ring dragon was wary. He wondered what Minya's plan was. After all, the bandits now knew he could make gold, which meant the others would find out soon. Min replied that he would simply eliminate in general anyone who came near him. Meanwhile, the mercenaries had already arrived at their boss's place. They took the gold they found in Minya's apartment. The boss was looking at the gold. He asked if this was exactly the kind of gold that Min could make. The mercenaries said yes. The boss broke out into a smile. Holding the gem in his hands, the boss was already imagining how he would gold all the teeth and generally now gold himself. He ordered Minya to be brought here. Min was in his apartment. He poured gasoline on everything from a canister. The dragon was surprised at such an act. After all, before, the former Min wouldn't have dared to set fire to his house. But now, he was determined to do so. The Electrum ring approved of such an act. Holding the already burning lighter, Min noticed that it was inherent in humans to change. He threw the burning fire on the gasoline-drenched furniture and watched the flames grow. Standing in the middle of the fire, he wondered what would happen next. Dragon praised Minya for such an act. He saw how he wanted to bring discord to the mercenary group. Dragon said that he liked Min more and more. The fire broke out. Even passers-by noticed it from the street. People were standing outside watching the apartment burn. The mercenaries were also there. One of the mercenaries asked whose apartment was on fire. An elderly woman answered on the 10th floor, where the debtor lived. Meanwhile, the boss of the mercenaries was taking a bath. He got a call about a fire in the apartment of the guy with the gold. This news made him very upset. Going up to the apartment after putting out the fire, the hired men reported by phone that it was clearly arson. The boss clenched his teeth in anger. She asked if it was possible for a third party to intervene in the case. He didn't like the situation and began to suspect Van, the one who had come to avenge his brother's death. The mercenary listened intently to the boss. He ordered him to turn his anger on Wang. He suspected there was a conspiracy. Next, the boss sternly said that the mercenaries know what to do. The assassin dryly replied that yes, he did. He hung up the phone. Turning to his associates, he reported the boss's orders. It was decided to deal with Van. The apartment and house looked terrible after the fire. Min was on the roof of the house and pondered. The dragon, watching Min, said that with his action, Min had left everyone fooled. Van opened his eyes. He was in some kind of torture room. Across from him sat the now familiar assassin. He tried to come to his senses. The mercenary noticed that Van was awake. Van came to his senses. He found himself tied to a chair by his arms and legs. Van turned to the mercenary for what he was here for. After all, he had done nothing wrong. The mercenary stood up. He confirmed that Wang had done nothing wrong. But the boss suspects he's done enough and betrayed his partner. A cold sweat broke out on Van. He didn't understand anything. Then the mercenary tells me that according to their inspection, the fire in the apartment of the guy with the gold is arson. And the guy with the gold is missing. The mercenary went on from there. The boss thought that Wang had told someone else about the gold and betrayed his partner. Van tried his best to prove that he wasn't. The mercenary pulled on his gloves. He didn't want to listen to Van anymore. Sitting on the steps, a gloomy girl was watching. The mercenary began to walk slowly toward the bound van. There was a terrifying scream from the basement. The girl didn't even move, still sitting on the steps and looking at her phone. It's been a while. The mercenary had finished and was climbing the steps. The girl moved a little, making way for him. She said the guy was telling the truth. The mercenary was covered in blood. For a second, he stopped. Turning to the girl, she smiled and said she knew it. Wang was exhausted. His nails and eyes were torn out, his body shredded. The mercenary knew he was innocent, but his perverse lust for abuse had taken its toll. The mercenary told the girl to call the cleaners to dispose of the corpse. She agreed. Meanwhile, Min sat in a tree and watched the house. The ring dragon noticed that Min was much more interesting with him than the previous owners. Min pondered the next course of action. The mercenary was taking a shower. Min quietly made his way into the house. He climbed in through the window. Stepping out into the hallway, the ring dragon advised to go left. The smell of blood was coming from there. He bumped into a gloomy girl. She was on the phone calling the cleanup crew for the corpse. As she stepped back, Min entered the room behind her back. The girl continued talking on the phone. He broke into the basement. That's where he saw Van, tortured, tied to a chair. He kept saying he wasn't lying. He looked awful, bleeding. Min leaned into Wang's ear and said that he believed him, and that his brother's death was really his doing. Poor Wang only experienced great pain. More screaming broke out. Someone rang the doorbell. The gloomy girl turned around at the call. There were janitors on the video intercom. The girl opened the door, letting the cleaners out. They entered quietly. The oldest of the cleaners asked how many bodies. The girl replied that alone, but he might still be alive. The killer was sitting on the couch watching a movie. He turned around, hearing the conversation between the girl and the cleaners. The janitors walked forward. The girl led them to the basement. They went downstairs. The girl stopped on the steps. Van sat mutilated in a chair, barely breathing. Senior janitor looked at the victim, realized he was still alive. He turned to his associates and said to get started. Min, meanwhile, was outside. He was looking at the laptop screen. The dragon wondered why Min didn't kill everyone at once. The one replied that they were not the only ones who knew about him. On the laptop screen, he watched the cleaners massacre Van. 2 hours later, the cleaners were done. The older man ordered the corpse to be carried to the car and went to get the money himself. Everyone went outside. 2 were carrying the corpse away. The older one was talking to the girl. She made a funds transfer from her phone. The older man thanked her. The senior said in parting that if anything was needed, they could apply again. The girl dryly replied in agreement. Min watched from around the corner as the car pulled away from the house. The dragon asked what to do now. Min replied that he would call the police. The next day, the police came to inspect the house. The mercenary's killer and his accomplice were arrested. The policeman called out to the captain. Everyone went down to the basement and found traces of blood using an ultraviolet lamp, exactly under the torture chair. The policeman informed the captain that all traces had been cleanly eliminated, and this was the only lead. The captain ordered the suspects to be taken to the station to get all the details. Min was in a tree not far from the house. He was watching what was happening. The dragon couldn't understand why the police were there, because they could have killed everyone. Min replied that the Major Crimes Department would help him find out something about those 2 mercenaries. And the police were better than the criminals, after all. Also, Min noticed that this was a good deed after all. The criminals are in trouble, which means he's not going to be around to help them. Ring Electrum was only surprised at this decision. Min replied that he had seen this on the show. The boss was woken up by the phone ringing. He was informed that a mercenary girl and a guy had been arrested on suspicion of murder. The informant guy was walking around town and giving the boss details of the bust over the phone. He said it was all handled by the Major Crimes Unit. He was excited and asked his boss what to do. The boss began to be covered in cold sweat. He didn't know what to say. He then told the detainees to sit down and keep quiet. Meanwhile, Min occupied the empty house of the assassins. He was sitting on the couch watching TV. Ring turned to Minyu, not confused by anything since he's in the home of the assassins, who are now dealing with problems of their own making. Min nonchalantly asked what was wrong with that. There would be no one in the house now for a long time, and insolence is second best. Dragon, upset that he hadn't met Minya sooner. That's when Min remembered one thing. Minya's blood debt to the ring has been recalculated for next year already. But soon the one who gave the ring would come looking for Minya. He asked what to do with the debt then. The dragon replied that he wouldn't leave until Min had settled the score all the way to the end. Min was surprised by this. The cops were interrogating the mercenary at the station. Other police officers were watching everything that was going on. The older man made the assumption that the mercenaries were a tough nut to crack. He didn't think he could get anything out of them. His assistant said he'd requested a report on the wire transfers, and they'd soon find out who they were working for. The senior officer decided to give the case only 2 weeks. The killer remained silent. Meanwhile, the boss was meeting someone at the movies. They needed to discuss all the problems that had arisen. They were sitting in the hall practically alone. John Doe asked how the case was progressing. Boss replied that so far the detainees were silent and had not extradited him. Jinya positioned itself as a collection agency. The interlocutor was silent. He was the leader of the Huade underworld. He went to the boss. He was very worried that if the detainees talked, he might be exposed. The boss was worried, sweat breaking out. Min, meanwhile, continued to live in the empty house of the assassins. He showered quietly and walked to the couch. The dragon suggested that he take off his Thutmose mask, for he had been wearing it for 2 days already. Min refused. He felt great. Electrum reminded him of the side effects. Min said that other than minor changes in his character and way of thinking, he didn't notice anything else. The dragon didn't argue. Wasting no time, the investigator left the bank with a printout of the transfers and was already calling his supervisor. The captain wanted to know who they were working for. The investigator, said the owner of the brothel Golden Spell, Dajinya. Immediately, the head of Huaidai called his boss and said that the police had already gone to Dajinya. His superior sat and listened in silence. Then he told the head of Huaidai that Dajinya should be removed and form everything under the DTP. The brothel owner drove the car nervously.
He was talking to someone on speakerphone, being invited to the police station for an interview.
He listened nervously to that call. His thoughts jumbled. The call ended and he hung up. Dajinya kept remembering his conversation with the head of Huaidai, saying that he had to be quiet, or the police would come after him too. Dajinya was nervous. He was afraid that Hudi would find out about it. As he approached the intersection and tried to make the call, a truck also pulled into the intersection. And while Dajinya was on the phone, the truck kept moving toward him. He widened his eyes with fear. The truck driver didn't even think of slowing down. He pressed the gas pedal and drove at Dajinya at full speed. Dajinya couldn't do anything but watch in shock. Min was sitting on the couch watching TV. Just then, the news announcer announced that there had been an accident. A truck hit the car of the owner of the Golden Charas massage parlor with the driver inside. He died on the spot. The culprit fled the scene. Min was completely unsurprised by this. He said that they were the ones who did it. The bandits are covering their tracks. The dragon didn't realize exactly who had done it. Min began to explain. He had said earlier that the police would help him find out who else knew about him and the gold. This massage parlor owner was one of them. Electrum didn't understand why Min thought that. He explained that the mercenaries had come with the brother of the man who had extorted money from him, and that the debt collector Min killed and his brother were working undercover. The mercenary and the girl who killed him were probably undercover collectors too. If the dead salon owner worked with these killers, he was killed by his own to cover his tracks. Dragon interjected to ask if he had understood correctly that his own had killed his accomplice. Ming replied that this was perfectly correct. Electrum questioned why they did that. Min explained that all over the country there is an active fight against crime and the killers are afraid they will come out on them as well. Meanwhile, a man entered the office of the head of Huaidi and bowed. The head took his eyes off the book and asked why the man had come. He, in turn, said that the case was done. The perpetrator of the accident had fled the scene and the police had no more leads. The head praised him. He also threatened that if someone was found on the trail, he would be killed. The man bowed and said he understood. Next, the head inquired about the country house where the assassins lived and how Dajin was connected to all of this. The man replied that he had done some research. The head impatiently ordered to speak. He told me about Wang, who was murdered in the basement of Wang's house, that he worked as a debt collector with a friend and that he knew Dajinya. Also that his friend was missing. That it was his partner's disappearance that started the whole story. Next, he suggested that we need to find this missing collector to figure out what this is all about. The head ordered to find out everything about the missing man. He also ordered to find out everyone he was assigned to as a collector. The man bowed and said he understood. Meanwhile, Min sat still in the same house and ate lunch. He took off his Thutmose mask to eat. The dragon had a question. He asked what Min would do if the mercenary assassins being held at the police station revealed everything. Min calmly replied that he was willing to give up his identity. The ring dragon didn't believe it and asked again if he had heard it. Min explained that Thutmose's mask not only affects his height, weight, physique, and thought process, but also changes his facial features. It was like the dragon had an epiphany. It's definitely true. And the precinct kept trying to crack down on the mercenaries. The investigator was again sitting at the table opposite the killer. He wondered how much longer he was going to keep quiet. It had been 2 days since they had been arrested. The one stubbornly stared and remained silent. Then the investigator said that Da Jin, the owner of the Golden Charms massage parlor, is dead. The mercenary's eyes widened. He asked what had happened to him. The investigator calmly said that he had died in a car accident. He was driving and had just been called to the station for questioning. He then looked at the mercenary and said that he obviously knew the person responsible for Da Jinya's death. The mercenary was still silent. The investigator decided to press on. He approached and asked that it was clear who would be next, and maybe the first one would be the girl who was also detained. Here the mercenary said he could tell you something, but required guarantees of safety for himself and the girl. Night has come. Min sat in the house on the couch, indifferently watching TV. He didn't take off his mask even at night. Suddenly the phone lying beside him rang. Min was very surprised. He didn't know who it could be at this late hour now. He understood the tube. It was the head of Huid. Min calmly asked who was on the other end of the phone. The head irritatedly said that because of Minya, he would soon suffer more losses and casualties. Min jokingly remarked that apparently the head is the one who ordered Da Jinya's murder. Next, he lay down quietly and asked why the man was calling him after all. The head called himself an honest and fair person. He also said that blessing Min had caused him a lot of trouble and made him suffer, so he would find him and want him to suffer. He further hissed through his teeth that he wanted to make both Minya's friends and loved ones suffer. Min just as jokingly replied that he was looking forward to it. He also said he had no family or friends. The head sat in his office angrily listening to this, and Min in turn called the threats nothing but empty sound. Next, Min simply passed out. The head sat out of breath with anger. Even his mercenary was afraid to look at him. The head clenched the phone in his palm until it crunched, and his eyes seemed to be bloodshot. He told the mercenary that he would only give him 3 days to find Jian Mingyia. The mercenary bowed and said it would be done. Min continued to lie on the sofa without a care in the world. Ring Electrum was scared out of his wits. He said that everything was over, and now the real trouble would begin, because this head was already a serious bandit. Min calmly told him not to make a fuss. No one had found them yet. The dragon wouldn't stop. He argued that this head was ruthless and even killed his subordinates in cold blood. Didn't Minya worry about that? The dragon wondered. Min advised Electrum to calm down. He said that such bandits would not live long in this country. Min further added that while he was wearing this mask, he was superior to them many times over, and that he had nothing to lose, unlike the head. The dragon was shocked at Minya's confidence. He noticed that his past owner was far from him. At the station, the interrogation was still going on. Da Jinya's death seemed to make the mercenary talk. He began by talking about the overheard phone conversation. Da Jinya once said that there was a certain underworld leader in Huaidai. The investigator was surprised. He had not heard of the chapter before. The mercenary confirmed it. He said something about the man through whom all the dirty business in town goes, even organ sales. The mercenary said that aside from drugs, he does absolutely everything he can think of. The investigator began to protest. If there was such a person, they would have caught him long ago. The mercenary insisted that this huge business still existed. He said he would have thought so himself if it hadn't been for one fateful encounter. The memories of the rainy night came to mind. He remembered standing in the rain on the embankment by the river 3 years ago. A man came up behind him, rolling a suitcase. He addressed saying that the place was very nice, and he didn't think anyone else came here. Then the mercenary, perplexed, turned around at these words. The investigator listened to the mercenary's recollection. He couldn't believe that he had just met the killers who had come to dispose of the body. The mercenary confirmed it. He said the man's appearance was very atypical. He continued his story. Da Jin once said that the head of Huaidi has a subordinate called a chain dog. He has an elongated face like a dog's face. The investigator still didn't believe in such a meeting. The mercenary said one of the owners of the casino disappeared just then. It was his body that was in the suitcase. He offered to check the river bottom at the riverfront if he was not believed. The investigator pondered his words.
Meanwhile, this same chain dog was keeping watch on the country house where the assassins used to live, and where Min was now. The lights in the house were on, and Chain Dog was convinced of his hunch that someone lived there.
The head of Huide reminded him over the phone that Min was only wanted alive. The dog understood everything from the order. Min calmly lay on the couch and watched a movie. The chain dog quietly climbed through the window. The electrum ring warned Min that someone was coming. Min was alert. The killer crept up from behind. He stuck a gun to Minya's head. Min calmly continued to lie there and asked how he realized the house wasn't empty. Killer chuckled, saying the water bills have gone up. Min was surprised but didn't move. The assassin continued to speak. Since Min was wearing a mask, he didn't recognize his face. The build was also different, but he recognized the voice. He was going to take Min to the boss. Min turned around. He said he would refuse. The assassin continued to point the gun at Minya's head. He said that if he refused, he would not guarantee the safety of his life. Just then, Min abruptly jumped off the bed and jumped onto the table. The assassin gritted his teeth in anger. He started shooting. Min dodged, but one bullet grazed the mask. From that shot, Min concluded that the assassin's goal was to take him alive. Min snidely noted that this was the third time the assassin had fired, but he didn't try to hit any life-critical organs. Min wryly remarked that the boss's order restrained the assassin's actions. The assassin angrily agreed with this judgment. Min pulled out a knife. Then he said he had no need to be wary, which meant he could kill the mercenary. The assassin was taken aback by this statement. He could not believe his ears. The chain dog pulled out a knife too. They began to circle the couch and prepare for a fight. They slowly approached each other. Approaching closely, the opponents stopped in front of each other. Min looked at his opponent. With a dry expression, "Let's get started." The chain dog was very angry. He was ready to kill Minya. In one swift movement, the mercenary made a sharp jump. Then he quickly began to move towards Minya. He threw a quick punch, but Min deftly dodged it. The chain dog kept waving the knife over and over again. Min dodged even faster again and again. And here's a new hard hit. Min deftly crouches down, avoiding damage. Now he had already decided to attack. Deftly deciding to strike from underneath, Min crouched down. Then quickly, throwing his arm forward, he was ready to stab the mercenary. And then a new one fell. Min knocked the weapon out of the assassin's hands. He didn't even realize how it happened. His hand simply loosened and he dropped the knife. Just in time to see him fall to the floor. Min didn't waste any time. He quickly put 2 fingers forward to stab the mercenary in the eyes. One more step, and Min landed a strong blow to both of his opponent's eyes. He bounced and crouched down. Blood spurted from his eyes. He was angry and swearing at Minya. Smiling, Min said that he hadn't planned to play fair with such a scumbag. Looking at the mercenary's grief with a hard stare, Min asked him to answer a few questions and maybe keep him alive in that case. The phone rang in Chief Huida's office. He picked up the phone. Min coldly wished him a good evening. The head was wary. He recognized Jian Mingya. Min calmly reported that he had received a scent toy from the head, but it quickly broke from a couple blows. Aloud, the head said that he didn't know what he was talking about, but he wondered if Chain Dog had been killed. Minya laughed at this way of putting it. He said since that was the case, let's assume it was an attack by a mere robber, and Min will inform the police in 10 minutes. He advised the head to prepare. The head hung up the phone. Dragon was surprised at Minya's willingness to call the police. He didn't believe him. Min asked why Electrum was so worried. Did he really think that the head of Huide would put a bounty on his head? The dragon replied that it was very likely. After all, Min had pissed him off. This is where Min lost himself. He began to say that he was Thutmose, the greatest pharaoh and master of the world. It seems that the mask was beginning to affect him seriously. He imagined himself on top of the world and said he had the power to punish his subjects if they committed crimes. The dragon was taken aback at this sudden change. Min looked at him sternly. Electrum started trying to talk his way out of it. He began to say that he should raise an army to avoid getting his hands dirty with these bastards. Min cut him off stiffly. He was already seriously beginning to consider himself a pharaoh. Electrum was afraid he had blabbed too much, and Min really did think he was a reborn pharaoh. Meanwhile, on the river, the police were trying to find the suitcase with the corpse the detainee had spoken to. A boat was combing the river. The scuba diver finally surfaced from the depths. He signaled that he had found what he was looking for at the bottom. From the boat signaled to land where the investigator was standing. They found a suitcase with a corpse. The investigator turned to the detainee and said that the detainee had not lied. The mercenary stood silently by the river. That's when another policeman called for an investigator. He turned around asking what was wrong. A police officer said someone filed a report about a dead body in a country house. He was described as a man with a dog's face, about whom the investigator had asked to make inquiries earlier. Both the investigator and the mercenary were shocked by this news. Meanwhile, a luxurious car was entering the mansion of the Huide head's mansion. He looked out the window. The head of Huide returned to his guests. He said that Lao Hong had arrived, and the meeting would begin soon. The head of Waide had gathered all the notorious bandits of the city in his house. It seems he had decided to put a bounty on Minya's head after all. The head of an underground casino in the city drew everyone's attention to the fact that it had been years since criminal dealers had gotten together. Another guest, who kept an adult business in town, noticed that they had stopped gathering after the mysterious disappearance of Jian Tong, the casino owner. Apparently no one in the group knew that Tong's death was precisely the work of the head who had invited them. The plastic surgeon, who was also in attendance, listened thoughtfully to the others. Just then, a middle-aged man entered the room. It was just Lao Hong, the broker everyone was waiting for. He apologized for the identification. The head of the underworld of Huid City greeted him. He said that everyone had just gathered as well. The city's chief criminals were discussing the situation. The head of the underground casino said that Dajinya, who was killed in a traffic accident, was being followed by the police. The man who invited them agreed. He said that it was Dajinya's workers who had blundered. Makler Lao Hong confirmed that this was true. The criminal gang leader who gathered them said that he had killed Dajinya. After all, he was weak and would not have survived the police interrogation. The head of the adult industry listened and smoked a pipe. The plastic surgeon asked why they were invited here. The man who invited them agreed. He said that the man who drove Dajinya to extremes was still alive. None of them could be safe. Someone asked what could be done. The host of the meeting folded his arms. Ji calmly said that he had to find and kill him for the greater good. Meanwhile, the police arrived, and the country house. They investigated the corpse of Chain Dog, the servant of the master criminal in Huaidi. The investigator asked if this was the person the detainee was talking about. The one confirmed that yes, he did. The investigator asked the police officers to find the case at the station and see if it was the same person. Then the investigator turned toward the corpse. He was overcome with heavy thoughts. Examining the corpse, he concluded that times are tough these days. The next day, Min was sitting in a cafe at this time. He was even without his usual mask. Behind his back, a few of the men sitting there began to whisper. They seemed to recognize him. One said he'd report to his boss. I think they were mercenaries from a criminal gang. Ring Electrum frankly sounded alarmed. He didn't understand why Min was sitting so openly in plain sight, since he was clearly being sought after because of the murder of a chapter's chain dog. Electrum warned that if Min walked around like that, he'd be found. Min slyly smirked and suddenly said that he was exactly what he wanted to be found. Min said that the wisdom and knowledge of Thutmose's past personality had returned to him, but some possibility in unlocking the abilities of the king's personality was not yet available. He said that the mafia chief would most likely send the bandits to him. He didn't want to miss such an opportunity. The dragon tried to object to something, but couldn't. Those who were watching Minya contacted the boss. He was just at a meeting with the mafia chief. He told the chapter that his men seemed to have found a similar man in the cafe. The head of the mob hesitated. The one whose men found Minya commanded to keep an eye on him. The guys in the cafe behind Minya's back understood the order. Dragon noticed that the two guys were weird and watching Minnie. Reported it to him. Electrum asked what was going to happen next. Min replied that he would wait until the two men had help. He wanted to find a deserted place and test the power of the king's personality, the power of Tuthmosis, on them. The dragon agreed. Then, Min abruptly stood up. The two people who were watching him also stirred. They thought for a second what to do. Then they decided to get up and follow Minyam. Min walked out of the cafe, the two followed him. Jianming led them to an abandoned construction site. Reinforcements from the bandits have just arrived. Those who were following Minhaj indicated that he was in this abandoned building. The chief of the grouping looked around the place with a glance. The gang started to go inside. Min watched everything from above. Dragon began to worry that there were too many bandits and whether Min would be able to handle it. Thoth put on Thutmose's mask and asked Electrum in no uncertain terms. The gang made their way to the first floor of the building. They all made the decision to split into two for each floor. Min was just hiding on the third floor, and two people with bats were already approaching there. They had equaled the room where Min was hiding. When the bandits walked a bit forward, Min decided it was time to attack. He took a closer look and prepared himself. Taking out his knife, Min quietly stepped behind the backs of the two guys who had come for his head. He quickly crept up and stabbed one. The second one turned to see what the sound was. Immediately, Min punched him in the face with his fist. He tied the guy up and leaned him against the wall. He needed answers to his questions. The bandit leader and his accomplice were searching another floor. Suddenly, he saw his subordinate also on this floor, although he had sent him to another. He was standing there as if he was out of his mind, his head down. This tensed the ringleader. He started asking questions, but there was no response. The subordinate mumbled something incoherent. about Pharaoh and his absolute power. The ringleader didn't understand anything. He kept asking questions. Suddenly, the man nodded his head. There was a sign on his forehead. He shouted like a zombie that Pharaoh's authority was absolute and that Pharaoh's orders were law. He shouted so loudly that his companions had to cover their ears. Then this zombie lunged at them. The ringleader had no choice but to hit him with all his might. He flew backwards like a skittle. Everyone's tense. What the hell is going on here? Footsteps were heard from somewhere far away. Everyone turned in the direction of the sound. There was just an army of the same zombies with symbols on their foreheads coming at them. Night had already fallen outside. The phone of the head of the underworld, Huide, rang. He picked up the receiver. Already branded and subjugated by Pharaoh, the bandit leader reported that he had found Jian Minya, who had been sent for. Min had used the Pharaoh's force of personality very well. Bandit then said that he would bring the captured man straight to the mob boss. Min calmly disconnected the bandit leader's phone. He ordered everyone to move out. The obedient slaves agreed. The car with Minnie and the bandits drove out of the gate of the house. Satisfied with himself, the mob boss sat reading a book in his office. The bandits brought in Jian Mingya, who looked quite shabby. The mob boss slammed his book shut. He got up from his chair and walked over to Jian Mingyu, who continued to be held by the cloaked, subservient zombies of his pharaoh identity. The boss came close and stopped, looking down at Minya from above. Min looked into his boss's eyes, tensed up. The mob boss smiled evilly and said good evening in his most mocking tone. The boss crouched down on one knee. He took Minya by the hair and angrily asked him if he knew what it took to catch and find him. Min smiled. He caustically asked to be told what it took to capture him. The boss became enraged at such insolence. He had already swung to hit Minya in the face with his fist, and then one of what he thought was his accomplices caught the hand that was raised to strike. The boss didn't understand anything. He looked sternly at his former executor and asked what he was doing, and then this mercenary changed his face. The pharaoh's seal appeared on his forehead, and he said that no one dared to touch his master. The mob boss's face turned white with fear. Already a former mafia leader was also being held by a second servant of Pharaoh. Min calmly stood up and untied his hands. The former mobster angrily asked what was going on and why his mercenaries were listening to Minya. Jin Ming calmly put on his mask and walked to the mobster's chair. Sitting down on the chair and putting his leg on the leg, Min said that he had just given an order, and all the boss's former mercenaries were in his service. He said that his power was many times greater, so there was no need to try to figure out what it was all about. Next, looking sternly at the mob boss, Min said that there were only two choices now: volunteer to be a servant or die. The boss angrily said he'd rather be dead than like this. Min questioned whether the man refused. He was sorry to lose such a servant. At that time, Jin Ming gave the order to take the former boss away and bury him alive. The obedient zombies obeyed. Min was settling into his new cross, and the former mobster screamed as he was dragged outside. Jinmin decided to flip through the book that the mobster had previously read. The dragon asked, why didn't Min subdue the boss with the power of Pharaoh's royal persona? Min replied thoughtfully that he respected everyone's right to choose. The dragon looked at him skeptically. In the courtyard, two zombie servants were burying the former head of the mafia. He screamed helplessly and tried to call for help, but his fate was already sealed. On the morning of the third day, the invited heads of the criminal gangs gathered again. A plastic surgeon, a participant in the meeting, wondered why so many gather so many times and so often in a short time. The head of the adult industry disappointedly muttered that the boss doesn't get smarter with age, and all the fuss is for the sake of catching one man. Only the broker was quietly drinking his tea. Just then, Jian Ming walked in wearing his Thutmose mask. The woman in charge of the adult industry was surprised. She thought it was a new member of their gang. Min walked in silence toward the former mafia head's chair. He calmly sat in it and looked around at everyone. That's when it all became clear. The eyes of everyone present just widened at the realization of what had happened. Min calmly put his foot down and announced that he was their new boss from today. It's been 3 years. Somewhere in Asia, in a secret facility underground, an elevator descended. 2 men were riding in it. The elevator door opened and one of them was pointing the way to the other. The guide began to tell me that for the past few months, the 1,567 object had been closely monitored. The object had been assigned a Class C rating. Escorting the guest into the bowels of the secret dungeon was Zhou Tao, the manager of the Huaxia Ancient Relics Protection Association. He said that the observed object had the power to turn objects that had blood on them into gold. The guest who was invited to the dungeon was Wang O, a consultant for the association. They stopped in front of a large, powerful door. Zhu Tao had to scan retinas and fingerprints for access. He was standing at the door, Removing the card key from his neck, Zhou prepared to open the door. He swiped the card with the key on the lock, then scanned the fingerprint, and only then the retina. The computer voice confirmed Zhou's identity. The men walked through the open door of the lab. They entered a huge white hall where workers in protective suits were conducting their experiments. Zhou said that the association began collecting materials on the 1567 facility last week. He said the situation was dire. Gold bars were becoming more and more plentiful. Wang O inquired if someone is abusing the facility being observed. Turning to Wang O, Zhou replied that yes, he did. They walked up to the counter with the specimens. Under the glass were samples of gold and pictures of corpses that had been turned to gold. Wang O became angry. He saw blood stains on the samples. Zhou said that the facility's custodian uses human bodies to create gold. Samples of such gold were found on the black market in Huida 3 years ago. Zhou turned to Wang O in a stern tone. He said that he simply had to find the keeper of the object. Wang O decided to go to Huide City immediately. He took the first flight out. On the plane, he was served food and water. Wang O looked carefully to make sure the stewardess had moved far enough away. He turned to the strange object worn on his arm. Van asked what the object thought about the whole situation. Something worn like part of a glove on a hand was a Class D object, codenamed the Golden Hand. It appears to be sentient, just like the Electrum Ring. The Golden Hand said that the keeper of the relic that can turn things into gold is clearly insolent. Van asked if that was all the Golden Hand thought it was. The Golden Hand was surprised at Van's demanding nature. She said that they said the artifact could certainly turn stones into gold, but it was highly doubtful. Hardly anyone had created such a powerful artifact. The airplane finally landed at the airport in the city of Huide. Wang O walked out into the airport building looking for someone with his eyes. A man in a suit with a large placard in his hands attracted Wang O's attention. A guy called out for Wang O to come over. He said he would be Wang's assistant in this mission. His name was Wu Liliang. Van leisurely approached him with his luggage. Wu Liliang held out his ID card. Wang O scrutinized it carefully. He compared the photo on the ID card with Wu Liliang's appearance. After making sure the photo matched, Wang O handed the ID back to his new assistant. Wang commanded to go to the car. Wu Liliang answered as loudly as if he were in the army. Wang asked him to be somewhat quieter, but it didn't help. They got in the car and hit the road. Van was reading a book about Egypt. Liliang was driving. Liliang was asked if this was Wang's first time in Huide City. Wang asked back, asking if this was Wu Liliang's first time on such an assignment. Smiling, Wu Liliang replied that Wang's guess was correct and the task was first. Lilian said that before that he was an office worker. It was only last year that he passed the background check. Wang O was the first specialist Wu Liliang started working with. Van wondered why he wanted such a job. After all, it's an extremely dangerous position. There are a lot of deaths, and some of the assistants even go crazy. Wu Liliang said that all of his relatives and friends were related to the investigation of secret facilities, and all died. In memory of them, Wu Liliang decided to become an assistant. He wanted to see what they were up against. Wang O was surprised at this answer. 2 hours later, they were sitting in a cafe. Wu Liliang handed Wang O a folder of documents. It was data on the same facility that turns human corpses into gold. Wang O scrutinized the data in the folder. He was surprised by the fact that in addition to gold bars on the black market, other gold was found in the jewelry shops of the city of Huide. Lilian replied that it is. The approximate order of transformation into gold is things. Gold, human bodies. At first, the first object transformed was stone, and then something happened, and the object's keeper started using human bodies. Van reflected on what he had heard. Then he stood up abruptly from the table, getting ready to go somewhere. Liliang was surprised to see such a quick change of mood. Wang commanded to go to the jewelry shop. They reached the place rather quickly. The sign above the door was exquisite. The shopkeeper looked unhappily at the uninvited guests. Wang and Liliang went inside saying hello. The shopkeeper was not happy. This questioning was hurting his business. He began to say he couldn't remember anything, and it had been a long time. Wang O put his hand on his assistant's shoulder, signaling for him to be quiet. He said that this time they had come to clarify something else. He took out of his pocket a hand with the Golden Hand artifact, but besides it, also a watch on a chain that is used for hypnosis. Wang brought it to the eyes of the shopkeeper. He began swinging the clock pendulum from side to side, putting the shopkeeper into hypnosis. When the desired level of hypnosis was achieved, Wang put the watch away. Lilian looked admiringly at the work he had done. Wang O then started asking questions about what the person who brought the gold here to sell looked like. Wang O went around to all the employees of the jewelry store. Hypnotizing each one, he asked about the appearance of the guy who brought the gold. One girl described a skinny guy who was obviously in need of money. The second girl was an assistant, also talking about the skinny guy. Wang O drew a portrait of the alleged suspect and showed it to the shopkeeper. He was still under hypnosis and said that it was the portrait of the guy who had brought the gold. After the jewelry shop, Wang O and Wu Liliang went to a cafe for a break. Liliang admired Wang's skill. He asked if there was something about the pendulum clock that Wang had so cleverly hypnotized the jewelry store employees with. Something that helps you remember things you've long forgotten. Wang replied that the watch was the most ordinary one, but he used a special level of hypnosis. It was taught in the association. It was known as Artifact 444, or Ancient Greek Hypnosis. Wang added that hypnosis had the most ordinary basic level. Wu Liliang was surprised at what he heard. The artifact on Wang's hand, called the Golden Hand, couldn't take it anymore. It reminded him that without its help, Wang would have had 10 years to master the level of hypnosis. Lilian was asked if he could learn this skill. Wang looked approvingly at his assistant. He replied that after this mission, he would have enough points for a simplified version of hypnosis. Yu Lilian was encouraged by what he heard. Van looked at the portrait he had drawn from the words of the jewelry shop employees. Looking at him from the pages of the notebook was none other than Jian Ming. An hour later, Wang O and Wu Liliang came to the police station. They tried to use the police to search the database for the man in the portrait. But the officer only said that the man had been missing for 3 years. Wang O hesitated for a moment. He asked if there had been anything unusual before he went missing. The officer thought for a moment, going over the facts in his head. Continuing their investigation, Wang O and Wu Liliang came to Jian Minya's house where his apartment had burned down. Wang wondered why the host of an object capable of turning objects into gold didn't even try to cover his tracks. Wang O suggested going up to the floor to canvass the neighbors. Maybe someone will remember something. On the floor, they went to the door of the neighbor's grandmother's grandmother. A neighbor said the man who lived in the burned-out apartment disappeared 3 years ago. Then an idea struck Lilian. He asked the woman to give more details about the disappeared man. She said he had run away because of debts, and she recalled that he had had conflicts with a debt collector before the fire. She then said that it was just after the conflict that the fire occurred.